When Ragnar and I first decided how to organize this event, we decided on those two quotations that Chris just read for you. So I'm going to start with those quotations, and then I'll use them to move into what I consider science to be, or from an evolutionary biologist perspective. And then I will move into evolution itself. So to start with the quotations, the first one, which was just read, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." When I first considered this quotation, I considered it from an evolutionary biologist perspective. And my first inclination was to be diplomatic to my peers. So for example, an ecologist or a physiologist working down the hall on an everyday practical sense might have no recourse to refer to evolutionary principles in his or her research. And so I thought, to be diplomatic, I could say something like this: everything in biology makes more, or at least as much, sense when illuminated by the light of evolution. And what I mean by that is a physiologist who's studying perhaps an organism that performs particularly well, unusually well, in low oxygen conditions, just as an example, might be able to study that situation perfectly well without recourse to evolutionary principles. But if he or she were to apply evolutionary principles, then he or she might learn that that organism possesses a unique feature that no other organism possesses, no other species. Or they might find that it's a member of a group of species that all share that common property because they inherited it from a common ancestor. And so I decided that this would be one way of taking that statement and bringing it to modern times in a diplomatic way, but I don't think it captured what Dobzhansky was after. And so I thought about science in general as a human practice. And science, in a way, is run by an evolutionary process. Scientists come up with hypotheses and ideas. If those ideas are advantageous, they allow us to understand the natural world better, then they will become much more prevalent, if you like, in the population of science within the scientific community. They will propagate, they will be inherited by the next generation of scientists, the graduate students and undergraduate students, and it will be inherited with change over time. And in that sense, science itself is an evolutionary process. And so I thought nothing in science makes sense except in the light of evolution might be more closer to what Dobzhansky had intended. But it still doesn't quite capture what Dobzhansky intended, at least I don't think so. So then I cast my mind beyond the practice of science and to nature itself. And I thought about the stuff that all living things are made of. And of course, the stuff that we're made of ultimately has its origins in stars. A universe without stars, as one of my colleagues has said, would be devoid of life. Stars produce the elements from which we're made. One of the vital elements in life is carbon. It allows life to occur, and stars create carbon. Without stars, there would be no life. So in a very real sense, in a very profound sense, nature makes sense in the light of evolution. And by this, I don't mean that evolution explains the Big Bang, and I don't mean that evolution explains how elements are formed. It just places a very interesting context for all of nature. And we can understand how the universe came to be and how we came to be in it by thinking of it in evolutionary terms. The other quotation that Chris read is this one: "Evolution is a process which has produced life from non-life, which has brought forth man from animal, and which may conceivably continue doing remarkable things in the future. In giving rise to man, the evolutionary process has, apparently for the first and only time in the history of the cosmos, become conscious of itself. Evolution comprises all the stages of development of the universe, the cosmic, biological, and human or cultural developments. Attempts to restrict the concept of evolution to biology are gratuitous. Life is a product of the evolution of inorganic nature, and man is a product of the evolution of life." I agree with a lot of this, but I wanted to modernize it, bring it up to date. So I made a few changes, which are shown in colors, and for an evolutionary biologist to make corrections to Dobzhansky is a bit of a sin, but nonetheless, we take it in context. Evolution is the process that has produced life, which has brought forth humans, so I'm including the females in this now, among animals, so humans are animals, and which will continue doing remarkable things in the future. In giving rise to humans, the evolutionary process has, apparently for the first and only time in the history of the cosmos, become conscious of itself. Evolution comprises all the stages of development of the universe, the cosmic, biological, and human or cultural developments. Attempts to restrict the concept of evolution to biology are reserved. Life is a product of the evolution of our inorganic nature, and humans are a product of evolution. So having brought those quotations to bear, I'm going to now delve into science and what a scientist describes as science. And that's shown in this figure. So this is the scientific method, which you might have come across in high school. And scientists, as humans, make observations about nature, the world we live in. It leads them to ask questions. After asking those questions, they are led to suggest hypotheses. Those hypotheses, in turn, allow us to make predictions, and those predictions can be tested. We can perform experiments, or we can conduct additional observations. One possible outcome of a test could be that the hypothesis is verified. That's one way of looking at this. And we can collect data that verifies the hypothesis, strengthening our probability assignment that that hypothesis is true. Another possible outcome, of course, is that the hypothesis could be falsified. And this is a eureka moment for scientists. Scientists spend their lives trying to undo our hypotheses. That's what we do for a living. If you can falsify a hypothesis, you've got it made. By falsifying a hypothesis, you've shown something to be inaccurate or incorrect, and so you have to go back to the drawing board, revise the hypothesis, or choose a brand new one. And this is what scientists spend our lives doing. Seems backward in a way, but that is how science operates. So that's what scientists do. We seek explanations for observed natural phenomena, and it progresses in an evolutionary type process by testing and refining hypotheses. And we choose the simplest explanation possible for these observations, not because we think nature is simple, but because by choosing the simplest explanation, we're creating a situation in which the addition of new data will falsify our hypotheses most maximally. We also make testable predictions about natural phenomena, and if they do not agree with predictions, if the predictions do not agree with the observations, we revise them. This gives us our theories in science, and theories are our treasure troves. And of course, we're here to talk specifically about Darwin's theory, the theory of evolution by natural selection. So I thought I'd give an example first, just to drive home what the scientific method involves. So we could make an observation. Say you went to Tasmania, and you noticed that there were no Tasmanian wolves there. In fact, no one has seen a Tasmanian wolf for about 50 or 75 years. You can see footage of a Tasmanian wolf on YouTube in case you're curious. This might lead you to ask the question, and I'll say this in a sort of Swedish tone for Ragnar's benefit, no Tasmanian wolves? And so, of course, this would lead us naturally to the hypothesis, no Tasmanian wolves. And of course, that would lead to the prediction, no Tasmanian wolves. Science can be a tedious process. Nonetheless, this would be a valid scientific hypothesis and prediction, and we could perform a test. We could apply for grant money to go down to Tasmania and search for Tasmanian wolves. And if we didn't find one, with every observation, with every nook and cranny we turn over, and we don't find a Tasmanian wolf, we're confirming our hypothesis. We're adding to the probability that that hypothesis is accurate. Of course, the funding agency would be really happy, especially if it was a conservation effort, if we could falsify that hypothesis and find a Tasmanian wolf. Now, this is doable because we know what a Tasmanian wolf is. We have pictures. You can see them on YouTube, as I said. We know what to look for. We know if we find it, what it is, and so on. So we can actually falsify this hypothesis. As an experiment, you might try inserting, instead of Tasmanian wolf, some other entity. You could put in a unicorn, for example. You could put in a flying spaghetti monster if you wanted to. You could put in a deity if you wanted to. Whatever you put in there, it has to be subjectable to the scientific method. And we'll take the example of a unicorn. When you get toward the bottom, you run out of room. You cannot do anything with it because there's no way to perform a scientific test. You cannot falsify that hypothesis. When you falsify a hypothesis, we have to go back to the drawing board. So I've put that in a box. That's a very important step. When you falsify a hypothesis, you have to go back to the drawing board, refine all your hypotheses, and start again, or build to an existing theory. And that's when science advances. Okay, so now we've got an idea of how science works, and we can move into evolution. And I thought I'd start with this figure. It's the Duomo from Milan, or in Milan, one of the nicest buildings on the planet, I would argue. And I present it because that's what Stephen Jay Gould uses to present Darwin's theory in his last work, The Structure of Evolutionary Thought. And what he points out is, this is a building which has a framework inside and a very ornate exterior. All the little doodads that you see on the exterior of this building were added on after. They're not necessary for the construction of the building, but they were added. And what Gould tries to use this as an analogy is that Darwin's theory, the theory of evolution by natural selection, is the framework upon which modern evolutionary theory is built. And over time, in the 150 years since the publication of The Origin of Species, we have added little bits and pieces to it, but essentially the edifice, the structure, the framework remains the same as it was when Darwin was around. A few changes here and there, little ornaments, but the edifice is still visible and the framework still stands. So what is that framework? Well, I've broken it down to 4 postulates. This is how it's often taught in classes. I think it's also a bit of a sin to present it this way. Darwin's book is accessible to everybody. You need no technical background. There are no equations. There's one figure. It's an enjoyable read, especially if you can't get away on holiday during the winter. So I highly recommend that anyone who has not read it before, pick it up and give it a try. The 4 postulates from which Darwin based his theory are shown here. The first one is that there's variation among individuals. So if we look among individuals in this classroom, we see that there's variation in any property you want to look at: height, eye color, hair color, and so on. We think that those traits are heritable. We inherit them from our parents. So tall parents tend to have tall offspring. Short parents tend to have short offspring. It's not universal, and it doesn't always happen. You can have the occasional instance where tall parents have short offspring and vice versa, but generally there's a strong correlation between the offspring and the parents in terms of their phenotypic properties, and we call that heritability. Individuals compete. This is the notion, and it's taken from Malthus and economic theory, that the rate of increase of resources is linear, arithmetic. The rate of increase of populations is geometric or exponential, if you like. And so there's a discrepancy with the rate at which a population would grow and the resources which are available to support the individuals in that population. Resources run out quickly. And so individuals are driven to compete with one another. Some individuals are better competitors than others. They survive with a better propensity, and they reproduce more efficiently or more effectively. And so survival and reproduction among the competing individuals is skewed. And the result of these 4 postulates in a population lead to descent with modification. There's a change in properties over time that, because of inheritance. Okay, that's Darwin's theory in 4 postulates. That's what it is. I want to discuss what evolution is not, because evolution is misconceived and misperceived in the public, in media, in TV, in commercials, and so I want to clarify some facts that might go a long way, because I don't think scientists get enough opportunities to correct these misperceptions, and they're as guilty as anybody about them because we often don't correct them. So I'm taking the time tonight hoping that this will clarify some facts for everyone in the audience, especially those who haven't come across them before. Natural selection operates at the individual level. Individuals are competing, individuals are selected for or selected against. But natural selection produces change at the population level. To give an example, here's a picture of 4 finches shown at the top. You can see that they have different sized beaks going from the left, your left, to the right. The beaks increase in size. It's not too easy to see, but you can tell that the first one on the left has a smaller beak than the last one on the right. And that the average beak size is somewhere in the middle. That's the situation before selection. If there were a drought or some condition that would favor larger, deeper beaks, then perhaps the 2 individuals at the far right would survive, and the 2 individuals at the left would die, which is represented in the figure at the bottom. And the average beak size would change. It would increase. The population would have changed in its composition as a result of selection operating on individuals. Natural selection has an object. It operates at the phenotypic level, but it affects change, that is, it brings about change at the genotypic level. So to go back to our birds again, if the property beak depth was heritable, then the 2 surviving birds will produce offspring that more or less faithfully reproduce that property. They have larger, deeper beaks. If beak depth were not heritable, shown at the bottom, then we might reconstitute the original population in terms of beak depth variation. And so the change is genetic even though it's occurring through individuals. The direction of natural selection. It operated in the past and it's operating now. But natural selection never looks forward to the future. It does not operate for the future. That's not to say that something that evolves now, in the here and now, can't be used in the future. It just doesn't look ahead. And to give it a good example of that, one of my favorite examples, is the soft skull that humans are born with. When we're born, as you probably know, the skull bones are unfused, and the skull is very soft, and it can be deformed when it's passing through during labor. Well, this could be seen as an advantage specifically evolved in humans to facilitate birth. Humans have ridiculously large heads in every sense of the word, but particularly in the phenotypic sense, for a mammal of our body size. We're born with huge heads, and giving birth is a difficult process. Because the skull is soft, the birth process is greatly facilitated. But even in Darwin's time, he noted that the sutures, and I'm going to quote, in the skulls of young mammals have been advanced as a beautiful adaptation for aiding parturition, and no doubt they facilitate or may be indispensable for this act. So we share this property with other mammals. But as sutures occur in the skulls of young birds, and birds were around a lot longer than mammals have been, they appeared on this planet a lot earlier than we did, and because they only have to escape from a broken egg, we may infer that this structure has arisen from the laws of growth and has been taken advantage of in the parturition of the higher mammals, or animals, sorry. So we have inherited the soft skull from ancestors. It's useful for giving birth in humans, but it didn't arise in humans specifically for that reason. Novelty. Natural selection operates on existing traits. That's true. But that in no way precludes novel traits from evolving. And as an example, invertebrates were around a lot longer than vertebrates have been around, a lot longer in absolute terms, maybe in geological terms, not so much. And there was a time when there were no backbones on this planet, and after a certain amount of time, there were backbones on this planet. So new traits can evolve. I'll point out some other examples of that later. Natural selection may produce adaptations, but natural selection might never produce perfection. So things can be adapted to a particular environment, but if that environment changes, that particular adaptation may no longer be useful. And by no means is it ever perfect in an absolute sense. And I will apologize in advance for the next example, but this is a biological consideration. And so mammalian reproduction, every month we're reminded about the fact that this is a horribly inefficient process, and it is definitely not ideal, not optimal. Natural selection and bias. Natural selection involves bias. That's definitely true. Natural selection may operate on variation that is unbiased, and that is true. So for example, you often hear the statement that evolution is a random process. Whenever you hear that statement, you should balk. Evolution operates on perhaps random variation. A mutation has no preferred direction. Mutations don't improve things or make them worse with any directive. It just happens. It can be positive or negative. But selection is definitely biased. In the beak example, the individuals that had the larger, deeper beaks survived to a greater extent than did the ones with the smaller beaks. And so natural selection is definitely biased. It's not random, and it produces a change over time. Natural selection and speciation. I like to live by the adage that extant species shall not beget extant species. In other words, living species don't arise from other living species. So whenever you hear the phrase humans evolved from monkeys, you also should balk. What we mean by that is that the chimpanzee lineage, that is the chimpanzees and the bonobos, and the human lineage shared a common ancestor more recently with each other, and that common ancestor is represented by this orange dot. They shared a common ancestor more recently with each other than either has with gorillas. But they're distinct lineages from thence on. Natural selection and evolution. Evolution sometimes is punctuational. It happens in spurts. You often hear about missing links and gaps, and I promised I would try to do a little bit of a Chris Rock, but I don't think I can pull it off without any profanity, so I'll just do my best. So gaps are often positioned as negative things for evolutionary biologists. But evolutionary biologists love gaps. We love gaps. If you go to London and you try to take the tube or the metro, they think of it as a negative thing. Mind the gap. That's something that you would warn an evolutionary biologist about. Mind the gap. But evolutionary biologists love gaps. There's more favorable gaps. There's this gap, which is a little more favorable. And David Letterman is astute enough to know that some gaps can be beneficial. He never corrected his gap and has led a successful career because of it. So there are many useful gaps, and as I said, evolutionary biologists love gaps. So just as God might have said, let there be light, we could say, by the same token, that Gould said, let there be gaps. And there was. As a brilliant move, he turned the fossil record on its head and said, the fossil record may not be imperfect. Rather, the fossil record may be perfect in some cases, but evolution just doesn't happen in a gradual manner. Sometimes it happens in punctuated bursts. Evolutionary biologists love gaps. Natural selection, theory. Evolution happens. It's explained by the theory of natural selection with some additions. So when you hear something like evolution is only a theory, that would be akin to somebody saying gravity is only a theory. And anybody who thinks that should be invited to stand up in front of the audience and defy gravity. So while you sit here, we are evolving. You're also being affected by gravity. They're both real phenomena in the real world that are described by theories, and those theories are what scientists work with every day. Now, evolution, aside from what it is and what it is not, it is also useful for many things. Evolution is largely the story of reproduction and mortality. Competition. Individuals that reproduce and survive better than their competitors will leave more offspring, and so therefore will contribute greater to the next generation in terms of their genetics. And that is what evolution is all about. Another way of looking at reproduction and mortality, of course, is evolution is about sex and death, two events that come once in a lifetime. But it also can be used to explain aging, dying, altruism, influenza, SARS, and it's also used in court cases nowadays. So SARS was identified using purely evolutionary tools. Court cases now are decided using purely evolutionary tools. Evolution is becoming more prevalent in society because it's useful. It tells us how to interpret the world around us. In 1802, Paley described what has now become known as the divine watchmaker. He suggested that if you were walking on a beach and you found a stopwatch, you wouldn't infer that the pieces had washed up on the beach one at a time and somehow managed to agglomerate together to form a stopwatch, but rather you would say that somebody had designed that stopwatch. This is known as the argument from design, and it actually, ironically, is what spurred Darwin off to seek an explanation for the complexity that he observed in nature. So he read this paper, and it's what drove him to start studying diversity. Dawkins, in the 1970s, took that same idea and to put it in an evolutionary context said, well, if the watchmaker is doing things, then he or she must be blind. Evolution has no prescribed direction, and so it must be a blind watchmaker. It seems that watches are used in analogies with evolution quite a bit, and so I thought I'd throw a third one in there, which is probably lesser known to people. It's by Herbert Simon in the 1960s. And he talks about two brothers that live in a town, and they're both watchmakers. They have shops in the opposite ends of town. And they're both very good watchmakers, so they have a large clientele. One brother builds watches one piece at a time, increment by increment, cog by cog, wheel by wheel, spring by spring. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that it takes 1,000 steps, 1,000 pieces to put together a watch. His brother on the other side of town builds watches in a very different way. He takes one piece at a time, another, and puts it together till he has 10. And he assembles those 10 pieces into a module. He then puts the module aside and does it again, builds another module, and again, and again. And then he puts together the modules into assemblies, and he puts the assemblies together to make a watch. These brothers, as I mentioned, are very lucrative. They have a lucrative business, so they have a lot of people wanting watches made. They both have telephones, but they're too stingy to hire any administrative assistants, and so they answer the phones themselves. When the phone rings, they can't afford not to answer it because the other brother might take away the customer. And so they have to put down what they're doing to answer the phone. The brother who makes the watches piece by piece, as soon as he lets go, will lose the entire watch, even if he's on the 999th piece. When the phone rings, he lets go, answers the phone, he loses the entire watch. The other brother lets go of whatever he's doing, which is a module. That module falls apart, but all the other modules that were assembled previously remain intact. As you can imagine, when there are no interruptions, no telephone calls, so say, for example, they go in on a Sunday, well, then you can tell that the brother who makes the watches piece by piece will have an advantage because he takes fewer steps to build a watch. He takes 1,000 steps. The other brother takes 1,000 steps to build all the components, but then has to put the components together, so has more steps involved in making a watch. But as I think you hopefully can see, as soon as interruptions occur, that is telephone calls happen, that brother will have a distinct advantage because when there is an interruption, he doesn't lose an entire watch at a time, whereas the other brother would. This difference in the watchmaking brothers is that one of them is modular, that is the brother who makes them into little modules, and that watch is also made in a hierarchical manner. That is how evolution operates. Organisms are complex systems, true, but they're built up in a hierarchical modular manner, and we have modules that function to do certain phenotypes. I'll give you an example of what I mean. So I'm stressing the idea of modularity and hierarchy. This is a fruit fly, classified in the group or order Diptera, which means 2 wings. So the difference between this fruit fly and 99% of the other fruit flies that you'll ever see in your life is that this one has 4 wings. Usually fruit flies have 2 wings in the front, and then 2 what are known as halteres in the back. And they're very reduced. They look like little paddles. This individual has undergone a mutation in one gene, and that gene has effectively changed one module in that organism and has made it build 2 hind wings. It looks very much like a dragonfly. The dragonflies are a much older group, and they were around a lot longer than have been Drosophila. We know this from the fossil record. This is an example of a macroscopic phenotypic feature evolving as a consequence of one mutation. Now this one's from the laboratory, so this one has been genetically modified to do this, but it happens naturally in the lab. If you expose them to certain chemicals, it's a mutant gene. This is a mutant that has an allele that has been changed, and that allele has made the organism produce 2 hind wings, where normally it would have 2 tiny little paddles. Another example is shown here, a front-on view of a Drosophila, and we see that there are legs where antennae should be. So those 2 meandering appendages coming out of the head are legs. They should be short antennae. Again, this organism has had its module, the module in the head region close to the mouth, has been modified so that the cells in that region think that they're on the abdomen, on the thorax. If they're on the thorax, it will produce legs. Because the cells in the front of the organism think they're in the middle of the organism, they start to produce legs instead of antennae. This is a macroscopic morphological change that would produce a gap in the fossil record, and it's a consequence of a single mutation, and that happens because organisms are designed in a hierarchical, modular manner. They inherit these modules and the components thereof from ancestors, and if you would like to think of them as being designed in some way, then evolution designs them in a modular hierarchical manner, just as the brother who built the watches in a modular hierarchical manner built his watches. So with that, I think I will end with the first part of my talk.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Chris, thank you for taking time to organize this session. Jonathan, thank you for sharing the platform with me to discuss this important question. I'm standing before you tonight as the skeptic, as the unbeliever in our statement. So what I thought I would do is just share with you the reasons why I have like a skeptical outlook, why I'm an unbeliever. And that's what I would do for my session tonight. Now, surprising as it may seem, I've developed a skeptical or unbelieving outlook in no small part by reading literature and books that are sympathetic to Jablonski's statement. In other words, they agree with him. But after having read them, I say, I struggle. So let me share with you some of that. And to start, as an example, you may have heard of Francis Collins. Francis Collins is a very well-respected scientist. He was the head of the Human Genome Project that sequenced all the DNA in the humans a few years ago. Now, Francis Collins he actually, in his book, quotes this Dobzhansky statement. Then he also says this, no serious biologist today doubts the theory of evolution to explain life. So Collins would agree with Dobzhansky. And he is a serious scientist, yet I'm skeptical. So why? Well, the question I'm going to ask for us to consider, all of us tonight, is this question. So how does he, being an evolutionary-oriented biologist, how does he explain systems? How does he explain life? In other words, what metaphor, what an analogy, how does he explain it to us through what life is like? So later on in his book, he's going to say this. As a first approximation, one can therefore think of DNA as a software program made up of thousands of letters of code. So he's going to use to explain what is life, software program. Then he asks later on, how is this run? And he's explain a little bit about the ribosomes, which is an organelle inside the cell. But he uses the metaphor that it's a factory. And then this factory reads the bases as it reads the program, and then converts information into specific things, which in this case are proteins. So the metaphor here, or the analogy, is factory. The third one he uses is to think of the metaphor of language, okay? Words to languages are like proteins to the biology. So in just the same way that we can take words and construct great works of literature, very complex themes, the life can take proteins and so on and construct the marvelousness of life. So I look at that and I say, okay, metaphor, software, factory, language. Now, we'll just go on here. Another well-known, and then we're going to see if this is all set up, queued up, world-leading evolutionary biologist is Richard Dawkins. And he's going to comment on life. The question I want us to notice is, what metaphors does he use to explain life?
At Oxford University, Dr. Richard Dawkins is Professor of Public Understanding of Science. The author of several best-selling books, he is also one of Darwin's foremost defenders.
I suppose the great mystery of life is to explain where the complexity of life came from. Another way of talking about complexity is to say information. Information is a kind of measure of complexity. And the complexity of life is not just plain complexity, it's also adapted. Living things not only are complicated, but they do things, they survive. They do everything in their power to survive, and they look as though they are beautifully designed machines, machines designed to survive.
Okay, so what do they look like? According to Dawkins, they look like they are beautifully designed machines, machines that are built. So the analogy that he uses is a design machine. So let us put this together for us to think about. Oops, I don't want to start that again. Using the analogies that they bring forward, we see, when I look in the world around me, complicated machinery directed by software programs with information that directs the growth, repair, development of cells, organs, and organisms. That's the metaphor that are used. Now, one of the rules of science is the idea of cause and effect. This is an effect. This is what we see in the world around us. So the question is, the root cause of this effect is what? In Dobzhansky's worldview or belief, it's this. In a sense, it's an accident or no program. So what we see here is the effect caused by that's the cause of it. Now, the question that I have, now I'm by nature skeptical. I don't believe things very easily. The question that I have is this the simplest, most direct explanation for this? I submit it isn't. I mean, if it's you know the old phrase, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, maybe it's a duck. Well, if it looks like it's a machine, maybe it's a machine. The problem here, of course, is the machine's an artifact of an intelligent agent. But think of all the metaphors that were used by people who don't believe there's an intelligent agent, program, language, factory, a machine. So I submit that it's not the simplest, most direct explanation. The simplest, most direct explanation is that, no, that we see complicated machinery because there's some machinist or designer behind those machines. Now, I'm willing to suspend my disbelief Okay, because not everything in life is always the straightforward, easiest answer. So I'm willing to suspend my disbelief. But in doing that, I find that the burden is on Dobzhansky or so on to back up its explanation. Because you're already, in a sense, you're already asking me to put some faith, but because you're bypassing the most direct explanation. Now, there's some ways we can do that. You know, we can observe it happening today. We can provide evidence of it occurring in the past, and so on. So these are some ways that we could kind of work our way through and to provide that evidence that we're looking for. So what I want to do is I'm going to cite some literature. The main sources that I'm going to use, not all of them, but 3 sources that are used at Mac, the evolution biology text here, development biology, and one of the geology text, environmental paleontology. So these are my 3 main sources that I used to ask this question, what can I back up with? So when I asked the question, one of the questions I said was, well, I could back it up by observing it today. So I'm going in my textbook, and in my development biology textbook, it says, yes, I can observe evolution happening today with the case of the stickleback fish. And so just so you know, there's a marine stickleback fish right here, and there's a freshwater stickleback fish right here. And the way this is saltwater, of course, and you'll see here that it's much more, it has these spines that come out here, and here there are no spines. So these are the ancestral species that gave rise to these ones. Okay, so now my textbook comments on that. It says, freshwater sticklebacks evolved from marine sticklebacks. Marine sticklebacks have a pelvic spine, right here, okay? Freshwater sticklebacks do not have a pelvic spine. It's missing right here. Thus, a pelvis without lacerating spines evolved in the freshwater populations, okay? Then we'll go on in my text. And so the question here is, that's what we observe, but why do we observe it? Well, it's going to go now in my text back to the DNA, a certain part of the DNA. And it says, well, the reason we don't see it is because the enhancer region, which is part of my DNA, a part of the chromosome, no longer functions in the freshwater species. Thus, the enhancer has been lost, and with it the pelvic spine. It appears to have been the result of independent losses of this domain. And then my conclusion then is here we see the mechanisms by which evolution can occur. So now, but I want to go back to what we're talking about here. And if we go back to Dobzhansky's qualification, what is it we're supposed to be looking for? And so it's a process, and it's going to bring forth, I haven't rearranged it, but man from animal, giving rise. And I'm not worried in particular words here, but you can look at the words I've underlined. But the whole idea is that there's a process where over time, and not all the time, but over a period of time, we're developing things. We're getting something new. If you want to put it a long time ago, we start with goo, and then today we end up with you, okay? So there's something new here because a long time ago there were no ears and those kind of things, okay? So what I'm looking for, okay, and this is where different points of view, but what I'm looking for anyways, is I want to see not just any kind of change, but I want to see a change where I see something new that wasn't existing before. That's the thing that I'm looking for. But I don't find that, right? The example that was given to me is I've lost something. I start with the pelvic spine, and I don't disagree with the observation. We haven't gotten anything new, is what I say to that example. So that's not the kind of example that I'm looking for. Now, the next example that's given to me is the evolution of the soapberry bug. And it's a kind of bug with a long beak. This is taken just from a picture of my text. And it lives on a certain kind of tree. Okay? And then what happened, this is a caption in my book, is that they lived on a specific tree and they had long beaks. Then in 1926, a new host tree was introduced. Okay? So they moved to a different habitat. And a change in the average beak length was observed. So here we have a long one, and there we have a shorter one. So the conclusion is, the soapberry bug population evolves. The characteristics of soapberry bugs have changed substantially. And then we're going to go in and look at a scatter plot diagram. So this is a diagram that's kind of supporting the data that's supporting this. And you'll see here there's a timeline over a long period of time where they've been collecting soapberry specimens. So what I've done is I've just superimposed on our text here 1926 when the new tree was introduced. So right about here, there's 1920. I superimpose, there's the new host tree's been introduced. Okay? And then I'm just going to ask this question. I see a certain range of beak length, and remember the phenotype is just expressing what's in the genetic information in the population to begin with. It's expressed in different ways. So really, I have a broad range here of information from whatever, goes from 5.5 to 9. After the tree is introduced, there is a selective pressure and something happens, but what do I end up with? I guess the question I'm asking is, do I gain anything? And all I interpret this is that we've actually lost something. We actually now have less information, because whereas before we had the information to give this kind of range, now we're about half the kind of range. So I would, as a skeptic, because I'm a skeptical kind of person, have we really seen an evolutionary change? Well, we've seen a change. But I'm looking, as a skeptic, for a certain kind of change, and the change that I'm looking for is a process that gives me something new over time. So I think that's not really what I'm looking for as the kind of observation that I want to see. Then I'm going to go, and now this is from my text. See, this again is what it's saying as a theory. It's tended toward increases in complexity, degree of organization, and specializations over time. And so now the example that can be used is flightless birds give evidence of both micromutation and microevolution and macroevolution. And so the idea here is that certain birds lose their ability to fly because the wings mutate. And so in certain environments, like where there's no predators and it's very windy, it's actually an advantage to lose your wings. But the question that I have still, I'm not looking for it necessarily, is this advantageous? Because sometimes things could be advantageous, but I'm not getting anything new. But if I have an example where I start with a bird with wings and end up with a bird with no wings, the question I'm asking is, have I gained anything? And I would just say, no, I haven't seen that thing where I'm gaining something yet. And so I look at that, see, there's my theory that Dobzhansky tells me about. This is what I observe, reduced or useless body parts. And I'm saying that as a skeptic, it's not the thing I'm looking for. I want to see something new come about, and losing something is not really the thing, doesn't help me. But what about natural selection? And we got the same picture. And so here we see an example of the variation on bird length. And John did a great job explaining that, so I won't go into it in detail. And so my text then says, as a summary of this, these studies on the bird show that the theory of evolution by natural selection can be tested rigorously by direct observation. However, the question is, now look at this, again, as being a skeptical kind of person, what did I start with? I started with genetic information that gives me this kind of range in the population. The average is here, but I have a whole range. Certain species were selected against in that they couldn't pass on their genes, and so that I end up with an average length that increased, but I increased my genetic information? No, I actually have less genetic information because I've lost something. I've lost the information to give me these birds over here. So the question, even though I observe this, I do observe natural selection, and as we'll go into natural selection in a bit. The thing here, that's why this is difficult, really. What I'm looking for is to see something new. And here is why is this a challenge by natural selection? Because just think about it, natural selection, just by definition, is you have something to work with, and only a subset of what you have to work with survives. And if I have a subset that survives, I've always, by definition, lost something, right? So, and that's why it's saying natural selection can only act on variation in existing traits. So I need some mechanism to give me something new. Natural selection will not do that by and of itself. Now here's an important point. I'm going to deviate from my text. Selection does not presuppose evolution at all. You don't need to believe in evolution to believe in selection. Actually, selection, all those examples, stickleback fish and so on, I don't dispute them. As a matter of fact, here's a quote from a guy in 1835, Okay, he was a naturalist, so it's about 15 years before Darwin. And notice, now he's going to talk about how rabbits change their color. You know, winter they go white and so on. And then he asks, are these seasonal changes of color of the rabbit intended by Providence, so that's the Victorian way of saying God, as an adaptation to change of temperature, or as a means of preserving the various species from the observation of their foes? By adapting their hues to the color of the surface, they answer both purposes and are among those striking instances of design. He observed selection, but he attributes it to a designer. And so you don't need to believe in evolution to both believe in and see selection. Because the designer put that whole system there in place so that as the environment changes, the genome can then keep surviving. That was an important point for me. They're not the same thing at all. The thing I'm looking for is a mutation, but we all know basically almost all mutations are deleterious or bad. But I'm looking for a gain of function mutation. This is the kind of mutation that gives me something new that wasn't there before. If I can see some of that, then over long periods of time, then selection gives me something to work with. So I go in the back, I always do this, every book I thumb in the back in the index and I see if we can find a gain of function. So there is actually a gain of function mutation in our evolution text, and it's this. Apert syndrome is a mutation. The manifestations are severe, including premature fusion of the suture joints in the skull, facial malformation, and fusion of the fingers and toes. So what it is, you know, as an embryo, we all have programmed cell death so that the cells between our fingers die off so we can have fingers. Okay, that's part of the program. And similarly, as John was saying, you know, in the bones in your skull, it's soft when you're born so that they can expand. So because of that, the bonds are weakened. This syndrome, this mutation, stops the programmed cell deaths. You're kind of born with your fingers fused. Your toes are fused, and your skull is fused, so as you grow, it doesn't expand and you look hideous. Because the mutant cells, now the way this works is that the mutation occurs in the sperm cells of the father. So because the mutants enjoy a higher reproductive success, the population of sperm cells that's in the father evolves. Consistent with this explanation is that apert are gain-of-function mutations. They enable the FGR2 protein to bind its ligaments more strongly and to bind to a greater variety of molecules. Now here's where I guess you've got to, there's the fact, and we may interpret this differently. So my text is saying this is gain-of-function because my binding is stronger. But really, what do I want? I want my binding to weaken so I can get fingers, right? That's really the purpose. I want the binding in my skull to weaken so my skull can expand. So to me, this is a little bit like, you got a car door, right? The car door is designed to open and close. If I have an accident so my car door is dinged and it won't open anymore, in a sense it's stronger. But have I gained a function? I would say no. You've actually lost a function because it was made, or similar if your door gets stuck here. And so I look at that and I say, well, as a skeptic, I'm just not convinced. I still remain skeptical, even as, I guess, I agree with the fact, but I interpret it differently than what my textbook says. So now, maybe it's not there in our text, so we have a little clip from Dawkins again. We're going to ask this question. What I want you to note is the question and then the answer.
Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
There's a popular misunderstanding of evolution which says that fish turned into reptiles and reptiles turned into mammals, and so somehow we ought to be able to look around the world today and look at our ancestors. We ought to be able to see the intermediates between fish and reptiles, and between reptiles and mammals. We ought to be able to see fish kind of on the way to becoming reptiles. But of course that's not the way it is at all. Fish are modern animals. They're just as modern as we are. They're descended from ancestors, which we're descended from. Way back 300 million years ago, there would have been an ancestor, which was the ancestor of modern fish and the ancestor of modern humans. And that ancestor, if you could have been there then, you could have seen the first steps towards a fish, say, coming out onto the land and becoming something like an amphibian. But that was a long time ago. You wouldn't expect to see that today.
So, just in summary, the question that was asked was, have you observed a mutation or some evolutionary process where you can see something new come about? Now, the answer was, I'm summarizing, you heard it, but if you could have been there 300 million years ago, you may have seen it. So as I survey, as I said, this reading of very many books sympathetic to the viewpoint of Jablonski has made me skeptical. It is extremely difficult to find. I actually have never found any yet. It doesn't mean you couldn't find one, but if you think about the immense complexity in the world, and we started really with nothing, the amount of information, there's got to be some process out there that's generating this new information, if this is the case, and it's really hard to find. So I just think I'll remain skeptical. But his answer was, if you could have go back there 300 million years ago, you could have seen it. Now we can't do that, but we can do the next best thing. And we can look at the past through the fossil record. So now we go to our invertebrate paleontology text, our third text that we're using. And so really what this quote is saying is, you can have various theories, but it's only paleontology. Paleontology is a study of fossils that allow you to see what actually happened. So let's take a look at what our text says, what actually happened. So before we do that, just a couple of predictions. There's various submodels within evolution. You can have either a slow and gradual or more jerky. If either this or this is the story of life, either one. Now, not every fossil is preserved. We're not going to see the whole tree. But maybe we expect to see some sort of outline so we can kind of see, not every organism is preserved, and we won't see everything, but maybe we can see a rough outline of the tree so we could determine whether it's this, or if this more punctuated equilibrium was what had happened, we'd see something like this. So that would be a prediction. So let's go to our textbook and see. Well, so now we're going to go to the development of metazoan, which is multicellular life. And so my textbook tells me there is no fossil evidence of the earliest stages of metazoan life. The first appearance of these fossils is very abrupt. They are already differentiated into various phyla, and those are one of the broadest groupings of organizing, classifying the animals. It's not easy to understand the evolutionary relationships of the various kinds on fossil evidence alone. So we don't see those lineages that we were hoping to see, but then we go on to the invertebrates. So now he's going to talk about a certain period in our history, and he says the early Cambrian fauna are trilobites, mollusks, brachiopods, and echinoderms, various invertebrates, starfish, think of lobsters, those kind of things. All of these appear very abruptly and are fully organized and differentiated on their very first appearance. Now, why does it say it may be difficult to understand? Because it doesn't really fit my original prediction that I had. Because my prediction was I would see some sort of lineage where I could kind of connect the dots in some way. I'm not going to connect the whole thing, but I should at least expect to see some. But he's saying that really none of them. So we'll look at the case of the trilobites. It's going to say, well, trilobites have a very complex compound eye. Okay? And so we have literally found billions of trilobite fossils. Now, the question is, so this is about something with information, the complex compound eye. Do we have evidence of a process where in partial ways this eye has developed? Well, they haven't found, just put it this way, they have never found a trilobite with a partially formed eye, whether it's a quarter or half or something, okay? Now, notice the interpretation here. This is from another, Raup and Stanley. They're well-known geologists. Now, here's where I say, is this a question of belief or fact? This is Raup and Stanley, 1978, Principles of Paleontology. To summarize, it appears through natural selection operating on chance variation, trilobites evolved a remarkably sophisticated optical system. Now, in reading that directly, I would think, oh, that means they must have found, because it appears this way, lots of these kind of partially formed trilobite eyes. But the fact of the matter is they haven't found any. And so as I look at that, knowing that now, I stand back and say, well, that's really a statement of belief on his part. He has a certain belief system, a certain worldview, and he's basically stating that rather than stating what the evidence says. And then he'll go on and say this. If we were going to do it, we'd need to know a whole lot about physics. And so that's what I mean. So this is a book where it's, in a sense, sympathetic to Jablonski's point of view, but without intending to, it's not giving me the, as I'm suspending my disbelief, it's not giving me what I'm looking for, and without meaning to, it's also, well, you need design. You need a designer to do this. So we'll look at more details. So back in our evolutionary text here, in mollusks, the early evolutionary stages are not preserved. Since it's not preserved, how do we go about determining what the earliest evolutionary stages are? Well, you can see the underlined word there. What's going to be used then is a hypothetical ancestral arch mollusk. So in other words, they haven't found the root mollusks from which, in the fossils, they've kind of got one on paper. But the one I'm looking for is the one on the ground, because I'm a skeptical kind of person. So what are the patterns in the fossil record? Well, there's two kinds of patterns in my text. One is called adaptive radiation. So what's an adaptive radiation? Well, an adaptive radiation is when a single or small group of ancestral species rapidly diversifies into a large number of species. Now, notice here, an adaptive radiation is a prominent pattern of the fossil record. It's as if the tree of life sprouts a number of highly diverse branches. Well, let's look at a few examples. So we've already looked at the trilobites and the echinoderms and mollusks. We found that there are no transitions. Now my text is going to go on and explain where these other adaptive radiations are. Adaptive radiations have occurred during the evolution of land plants, similar to the Cambrian explosion. We already looked at the Cambrian explosion. That was the trilobites and so on. The radiation of terrestrial plants are associated with the transition of terrestrial life and the adaptive radiation of land plants. In other words, in the evolution from plants from water to land, they haven't found any transitions. So now I understand, okay, so this is actually a UNB's biology evolution text that I was reading 10 years ago, okay? And so in the same subject, see, we don't find any. And so in here, what's used in this text is it's lost. So you go to the amphibian to the reptile. Well, we start out with amphibians, and then in an adaptive radiation, 2 waves, we see some reptiles. But we're looking for those links that will allow a skeptic like myself to see, oh yeah, because this really happened. And similarly with my UNB biology text. Insect radiation. So again, there's millions of insects, and they have hundreds of thousands of specimens, but they don't have any idea really. There's nothing connecting us from the beginning through the different trees, branches of the tree. Adaptive radiation are fish. So those are the patterns. It's called adaptive radiation. Okay? Now there's another pattern in the fossil record. That's called stasis. Okay, what does that mean? Fossil record contains many cases of new species appear and then persist for millions of years without apparent change. So that's what stasis means. Basically, stay the same. Okay? So that's adaptive radiation and stasis. Put those two together, that's what it's saying. And notice what it says here. It's speciation events that appear instantaneously in time. So that's what it looks like to a geologist. It happened like that. So now how does my text kind of synthesize all this? So, there's some examples of living fossils. So here we have shoehorse crab. Here's a fossilized shoehorse crab. Here's a living shoehorse crab. This is, from way back to the beginning of time, it looks exactly the same. Similarly, you won't be able to tell which one's fossil and which one's living unless there's a caption on that. They haven't changed a bit. Similarly here with some some up here. You'll see a fossil shrimp and a living shrimp. They all look the same. Ginkgo leaves fossilized right here, and then a living ginkgo tree. And then finally, this one here from my text, this is 1.8 billion years old here up in Canada, and it looks exactly the same as a stromatolite. This is basically bacteria, green algae bacteria that form on the seacoast, and it looks exactly the same. So we have a whole lot of time, but the thing hasn't changed at all, really. So then how did Darwin deal with this? My text says, Darwin's ideas were presented in opposition to the theory of special creation, which predicts the instantaneous creation of new forms. Now just a little segue here. Oftentimes creation is presented as not scientific. And one of the reasons why it's presented as not scientific is because it doesn't make predictions. Predictions are scientific. But here we're actually making a prediction of the real world, right? We're predicting that if the creator created something, we would see it instantaneously. And notice back to our previous quote, it appears, adaptive radiation, they appear instantaneously. That's what the quote had said. So actually, at a very high level, high altitude level, we do see some sort of overall match there from prediction to what's actually observed. But then it goes on and says, well, the reason what Darwin did to explain that was that he said, well, we haven't started collecting many specimens, and we just started in this new discipline of paleontology. Give us some time, we'll find the specimens, and we'll fill in the gaps. So that was then. And what is it now? Well, this is from Dave Raup. He's the curator of the American Museum of History, Natural History. He's kind of got the fossils. And what he'll say is basically, not only, some of the cases that we would have had, we've now had to discard, so we're even kind of in a worse situation than would have been in Darwin's day. So the situation hasn't improved any. So we're left with this. As I look at both today, what do we observe in the present, I don't find the evidence, not that I'm willing, I just want to see it. I don't see it. I look back in the fossil record, I don't see those kind of documented evidence I would expect to see. So, well, maybe the reason is it's really difficult to make a functioning machine. So one of the ideas is that reptiles evolved into birds. I know there's variations on reptiles, dinos, and so on, but that's the general idea. This is the way that the reptile lung works. It's similar to the mammalian lung. Air goes in and out like a bellows. Okay, that's how the reptile breathes. This is how the bird breathes. It's a unidirectional lung. Air goes in one end of the lung and out the other end of the lung. It still goes through the mouth, in and out the mouth, but it's unidirectional in the lung through a set of valves in the lung. Okay, so what we've got to postulate is how this. Now, whether you do it slow and gradual, like in 3 jumps or a lot of little steps, somehow you've got to come up with a system whereby you're somewhere in the middle between these two and the lung will work. And so how are you in a transitional state here is the question I have, and have the lung still function? And I've asked this a lot of different places. I haven't really, and so this is the kind of thing I say, okay, if we can have this at least postulated how this could work, maybe we'll find some way to, that be why there may not be those transitions. So anyways, just a couple of thoughts on Dobzhansky's statement, nothing in biology makes sense in light of evolution. What I want to do is just conclude here. This is when he lived. What would be the reasons that Dobzhansky learned and that he would articulate in his lifetime as to why he believed scientifically that evolution was true? Well, he was born in 1900 in Ukraine, and as a teenager in school, he would have learned recapitulation embryology as a science. And what that is basically, it's, I've heard of that, is that when you're an embryo, you're in the fish stage with your gill slits, and you're in the yolk sac with it's a throwback to the evolutionary stages. And so he would have learned that, and he would have seen, these are pictures taken by Haeckel about the turn of the century. There's fish, salamander, turtle, and you see how, in a sense, at the embryological stage, we're also similar. And so that was proof, or evidence, and he would have learned both of common ancestry, because we're very similar, and also as we go through, like say, the gill slit fish stage and then the amphibian yolk sac stage, that's evidence of our phylogeny. That's why ontogeny recapitulates or goes through phylogeny. Unfortunately, what he would have learned would have been wrong. As is well known today, Haeckel, he purposely drew those pictures wrong, and it was basically, this is what it really is inside the embryo for these organisms. You see how quite different they are? There is no fish stage or amphibian stage as we recapitulate, in the embryological development. So Dobzhansky would have been one of those people who would have read that as a high school student and said, oh, this must be the evidence. Interestingly enough, this is taken from my UNB text, 3 years old, and we know for 50 years this has not been true, but you'll see this picture that's used here is still very similar to this, and that's probably why oftentimes today I meet people, there's still some confusion as to whether this is true or not. So, and I know John would agree with me, this is not an evidence that anyone today who knows would use, but that would have been something that he would have learned. He would have learned that homology, the similar design on the vertebrae limb, would be evidence of common ancestry as a teenager. The problem is back then they didn't know the genetics, and one of the problems is that if we presume that the phenotype, the structure comes from common ancestry, our structure comes from A, genes, that's the information, and B, embryological development pathways, they are different. Same structures come from different genes and different development pathways, and therefore, how do we know then that they're really homologous, or common ancestry? Maybe they're more examples of convergent evolution. He would have learned the horse series of evolution, popularized by Thomas Huxley, and now that's the one that Dave Raup said we've had to discard because it's not a line anymore, it's actually a bush. He would have learned about Archaeopteryx as a transition between reptiles and birds, but we've learned now that really Archaeopteryx was a bird, so there was no transition as Archaeopteryx was. He would have learned about Nebraska Man as a grad student in the 20s, and Nebraska Man is shown here in an illustrated drawing, and he would have learned about Piltdown Man as one of the ape men. Nebraska Man was found from one tooth, and what they found out was totally wrong. But the thing about this was popularized, this was the case, the classic case for evidence used in the Scopes trials. And in the Scopes trials, this one nationwide, and so he would have learned that. But we now know that it was wrong. He would have learned about Piltdown Man. Problem was, Piltdown Man was discovered in 1912, but 40 years later, it was learned to be actually, it was not only a mistake, it was a fraud because someone had filed it down and put salt on it and made it look older. As a skeptic, what makes me scratch my head is 500 PhD dissertations were written on Piltdown Man from 1912 to 1950s, and no one caught it. That would have been something that he would have learned. He would have learned about the peppered moths, and that Kettlewell had done in the 50s, but now we've learned in the last 10 years they were actually glued to a tree and it was kind of like set up. And there were a lot of fraudulent photographs. He would have learned about Ramapithecus, who back then in the early 70s was like kind of one of the important links. And it turned out that Ramapithecus was an orangutan. So if Dobzhansky could stand up here today and say, this is why I believe from a scientific point of view in evolution, all the things that he would have learned, the main things he would have learned, today we would know they'd be wrong. And so I scratch my head at that and I think, wow, that's amazing. Here is, for all the reasons would be wrong, but somehow he'd still be right. It has nothing to do with reason. It had only to do with dumb luck, because all his reasoning was giving him the wrong reasons. And so I think, wow. Derek Ager was a former British, he was the head of the British Geological Association. He's basically saying the same thing. All the stories that I learned as a student, I've not learned that really weren't true. It still kind of happens. Sometimes we may have heard of Archaeopter. So that's, we found out that it becomes a very cultural thing. And so this was about 10 years ago. And this was a big splash with the National Geographic. And they really found that it was two fossils stuck together. So in conclusion, I guess what I've come to, I just think, you know, we believe, all of us have belief systems. Then we find reasons to support our belief system. Some of the reasons are, well, in this case, some of the reasons are wrong. Some of the reasons are very complex. But in the end, I don't find any of the reasons very compelling. So for that reason, I remain a skeptic. And so thanks.
Okay, I will respond to 4 points that I noted in your talk before I get to my beginning of my concluding statements. Sorry, my concluding remarks, not my concluding statements. First one, I guess, if Dobzhansky were in the room, I suppose, after, yeah, I do want the slides. If Dobzhansky were to walk in the room, I guess after first asking him what he's doing here, because he's been dead for 33 years, I suppose he would probably say that he'd be happy to see what you described as natural selection. You accept it. That's exactly what Darwin would say is evolution. Recall that he said natural selection is the process by which evolution occurs. The second point about Darwin, I think I would suggest that you were looking for something to be given. You see a lot of losses, but you don't see a lot of gains. Darwin had a problem with eyes, and the argument from design often takes the eye as its prime example. In an analogy with the example that I showed earlier with the wings and the Drosophila, there's another gene, so-called master gene, called PAX6, which is involved in the production of eyes. If that gene is mutated, an organism will develop without eyes. So it's easy to imagine, just as with the wing, having no wings. If we look at species of Drosophila, we don't see any half wings. We see halt ears and front wings. But from a genetic standpoint, we can understand how we could have gone from a situation with 4 wings, that is 2 front and 2 rear, to a situation with 2 front and 2 halt ears, 2 reduced wings. By the same token, we can see from a genetic standpoint how we can move from no eyes to eyes or from eyes to no eyes. In fact, we have so much control over that gene that we can cause that gene to be expressed in a leg in a Drosophila and have an eye produced on that leg. So these large-scale transformations, these gaps that would appear in the fossil record to an evolutionary biologist, especially one who's cognizant about development, are no problem at all, and in fact are very interesting examples. To try to give you something compelling, because I know you were searching for something, I'd offer the example of craniates. Craniates are a group of organisms that share the property that they possess a skull, a bony skull, and that skull is the derivative from a group of cells that appears during development, called the neural crest. That's unique to all craniates, and within the craniates, all vertebrates. So they all possess these cells, and those cells produce all the bones in the face along with a lot of other features. Now, one of those other features are teeth. So that property, that extra bit of cells that appears in that one group, and it occurs early during development in the craniates, produces all the cells in the face and as well the teeth. And all the organisms that share that property, we think, have been inherited from a common ancestor. And in particular, within that group, we have 2 groups that are notable, that is birds and turtles. It's interesting because both those groups, perfectly good vertebrates, there's absolutely no ambiguity. They are vertebrates. Every piece of data we look at unambiguously assigns them to the group vertebrates, and yet they possess no teeth. So there you have a good example of a gain, that is the property of a skull, which wasn't there before this group emerged on this planet. And at the same time, within that group, you have repeated losses, in 2 cases, birds and turtles. So if you're looking for something compelling, take something like that or a backbone, and we have confirmed evidence from genetic analyses, developmental analyses, that allow us to interpret how those traits might have evolved. The other item that you mentioned was Raup, saying that the fossil record, some of the examples have to be abandoned. That is a good example of a scientist behaving in a proper manner. He's refining his hypotheses. He's going back to the drawing board. And Gould is another good example of that, saying that we have all this evidence that shows that there's gaps in the fossil record. Maybe the fossil record isn't imperfect, and maybe those gaps represent what actually happened. Big jumps, just like going from 2 wings or 4 wings to 2 wings, or from no teeth to teeth, or teeth to no teeth, or no backbone to backbone. One other comment I'd like to make concerns this, the cuttings that you showed, or photographs made by Haeckel. Haeckel's work is disputed, but the one item that all scientists agree on is the term ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny is no longer accurate. However, all vertebrates still do go through those stages. They all do have pharyngeal pouches during development. They all show the evidence of a tail during development at the same stage early in development. So although his cuttings have been disputed, the data are undisputed and unambiguously undeniable. So all vertebrates do go through a particular stage that's common to all of them, and that includes pharyngeal pouches and a tail, including ourselves. Okay, so now I'd like to move along with, in the interest of time, to some things I wanted to say. I want to present some worldviews, because you presented a very attractive idea of different worldviews. So I want to present 2 different worldviews, and then I want to contextualize them in an analogy. I want to talk a bit about a scientific discipline known as intelligent design, and end off with some quotations. So to the worldviews. Science and religion can be thought of as two ways of perceiving the world, and they share many things in common. There are buildings that are constructed in which individuals can practice these human activities. So for instance, this building is part of a hospital in which science is practiced. We have places of worship where religion is practiced. There's books written for practitioners of both activities. The many scientific books are very dynamic. They change over time as scientists change their hypotheses to better describe the natural world around them. Religious texts tend to be less dynamic, and they're handed down generation to generation. People think differently in these two worldviews. Again, in science, radicalism is often rewarded if it's conducted properly. In religious circles, it's less radical generally. Because these are human endeavors, there's good and bad that occurs with both of them. Science has been abused in warfare. Religion has been abused in warfare. Good things come of both as well. Science has produced many great works, many great theories, and some wonderful prose. And religion has produced many interesting aspects to culture, traditions, and ways of living. So I want to build on that and describe a very simple analogy, but one that I haven't seen, and it makes use of eyes and vision, and that is glasses. We can wear one pair of glasses at any given moment. And I want you to think of a situation where you might have a choice between two glasses. One could be something relatively fancy, like these shades, or something a little less provocative, maybe some spectacles. And these are used for different purposes, of course. And you wouldn't want to use these for the purposes for which they weren't intended in the first place. So for instance, if you were driving home at night, tonight for example, you probably wouldn't be well advised to wear the shades. Driving at night with dark glasses could lead to some disastrous results. And similarly, if you're driving to Toronto from Hamilton early in the morning toward the east, and the sun was rising, you'd probably want to wear the shades rather than wear the spectacles. So we can wear one pair of glasses at any given time, and I put it to you to think of the analogy in which science and religion are glasses through which we see the world. And you can choose which ones you want to wear, and you can put them on, but things get a little bit messy when you try to use the wrong pair to look at the wrong things. And I'm going to choose as an example a friendly chemist. For some reason, everybody loves chemists. I know a few chemists, and they're very nice people, so I don't see why people shouldn't love them. But at the same time, they don't seem to evoke the same response from certain groups. Biologists have evolution. Physicists seem to have the Big Bang. Chemists, maybe because it's a young science, I'm not sure, or maybe just because they're very polite people. Whatever the reason, they don't bring unto themselves the same treatment. So I'm going to use a chemist as an example. And a chemist can go into his or her lab during the day and put on his or her science glasses and conduct perfectly valid scientific research, perhaps even Nobel Prize winning research, and then go home, and on the way home might walk through a park. And if he or she decides to keep wearing the scientific glasses, then he or she might marvel the same way Darwin did at the diversity that he or she sees around them. Or he might choose to change and use the other glasses and seek some other explanation for the diversity that he sees around him. Now, some of you are probably already thinking, well, there's other fancier types of glasses. You can have things like photogray lenses, which grow dark in the sunlight. But there's problems with those, as anyone who's worn them knows. I have. And when I enter the life sciences building and get to my office, by the time I get there, the lenses are still dark, and I try to write some computer programs, and out comes a lot of gibberish because I can't really see. That would be mixing things, and I'm not saying that that's a bad thing to do. You might want to try to see the other side of the worldview, see the other side of the world through different glasses, and that's up to the individual. And when we do, sometimes great things emerge, and sometimes not so great things emerge. And it's up to the individual to defend those things, and scientists do this for a living. So here I give one example. It's a gray zone example. This is an example of a scientist talking about religion, and Albert Einstein is often quoted by religious people as well as scientists because he's very, his opinions and writings change over time. It's very hard to pin down whether Albert Einstein was a religious person or non-religious. Here he's explicitly stating that I am not an atheist. I don't think I can call myself a pantheist. The problem involved is too vast for our limited minds. We are in the position of a little child entering a huge library filled with books in many languages. The child knows someone must have written those books. It does not know how. It does not understand the languages in which they are written. the child dimly suspects a mysterious order in the arrangement of the books, but doesn't know what it is. That, it seems to me, is the attitude of even the most intelligent human being toward God. We see the universe marvelously arranged and obeying certain laws, but only dimly understand these laws. That's beautiful prose. But I also said that it doesn't always produce good things. And intelligent design is an example of individuals wearing scientific glasses with a different perspective in mind. To give an example, this is one of the prime examples that's often offered from intelligent design, the notion of irreducible complexity. Shown on the left is an electron micrograph of the cross-section of a flagellum from an algae. And when you cut it across like that, you get what's known as a 9+2 pattern. We have 2 items in the middle surrounded by 9 items, all grouped in pairs. These are made of proteins, and they function very much like a spoke of a wheel. These are flagella that act, you've probably seen them under a microscope. If you haven't, they're like tiny rotary engines. These are really rotary engines built biologically. If you look at the construction of them, they seem very intricate. And the intelligent design proponents suggest that they're so intricate that one cannot imagine that these came about as a process of natural selection. They must have been designed by an intelligent being. The rationale is that they're so complicated that if you remove one component, that is, if you try to imagine the step before it completed its evolution, the one step before its final state, it would fall apart and wouldn't work. This was a classic argument brought about. Again, it's back to Paley's argument from design. Intelligent design always falls back on that as its main argument. In part C, we have an actual electron micrograph now taken from the sperm, the flagellum on a sperm from an eel. So it's an interesting choice. I don't know why this was lying around, but it was. And we can see that, in fact, we're missing the main components in the center. There are no spokes. So this example, which is one of the purported prime examples of intelligent design, falls flat. It falls to the ground like the leaves that we see now. Where did intelligent design come from? It came from a court ruling in 1987, Edwards versus Aguillard, in which the teaching of creationism was shown to violate the Establishment Clause to the First Amendment of the United States of America, Constitution of the United States of America. And the ruling in that courtroom was that creationism was unscientific and could not be taught alongside evolution in classrooms. So growing out of that ruling came the idea of intelligent design. Since creationism cannot be taught in a classroom, perhaps we could find some more scientific way of looking at things, some non-religious way of looking at things. In other words, putting on scientific glasses in order to forward a religious idea. Well, in 2005, this came to a head when parents, Tamara Kitzmiller, sued the Dover Area School Court District because her child was being taught intelligent design, which she claimed bordered on religious education because it was it was creationism couched as science. This went to court, and the documents are online for everyone to read. There's a 137-page ruling by the judge, so you can all access that, and I invite you all to read it. There's a lot of interesting information contained therein. To me, one of the most incredible pieces of information was this word shown here, C-design propenticists. A textbook was given to the school board free of charge through clandestine means and was sent or used in the classroom. This textbook was an intelligent design textbook. And in it, there was a lot of text. And in the court case, there was a lot of testimony given that this text was creationist text that had been modified to be intelligent design. And the way it was modified is certain words were searched and replaced, that's just as you would do with a Word document. And yet, interestingly, this word popped up, and it's exactly the word you would expect if you were replacing the word creationists with design proponents, but you made a little error. So you can imagine if you did a search and replaced, but accidentally made a little error, you would end up with this word. This word appears multiple times in the text. Now, in evolutionary biology, one of the prime examples we use for inferring relationships are signature sequences, mutations that are shared by different organism groups. So if we see multiple mutations in two organisms, the simplest explanation to explain those similar mutations in two organisms is that they inherited those mutations from a common ancestor. This is a wonderful example of a mutation, a mistake, showing the evolutionary history of this textbook, showing that it was creationist literature that had been doctored to become intelligent design literature. Now, intelligent design is a scientific theory, but according to the courts, it's not. The court ruled that intelligent design borders on religious theory, and so it cannot be taught in the classroom. So at best, intelligent design should be considered as contested science. Most scientists do not look upon intelligent design as a valid theory. I personally find it useful because it always keeps us honest to have alternative theories around, but if any of you have ever encountered evolutionary biologists, you know that they're a cantankerous bunch, and so we don't need alternative theories to keep ourselves honest. But at its very worst, intelligent design was presented as science from a non-religious perspective, and yet in the court case it was exposed unambiguously as being religious doctrines, ideas, doctored to become scientific. It was a prime example of putting the wrong glasses on and being caught doing it. So I would put it to all of you, if you haven't explored intelligent design, that you explore it for yourself and make up your minds. If you think that it's a good scientific theory, then by all means consider it. But if you don't, then I suggest that you consider it in a different light. Okay, I said I was going to have some quotations, so I thought I should. I'll start off with one which is how I would interpret some of the intelligent designers, from Justice Potter Stewart. Some of you may be familiar with this quotation when he was trying to assess whether a particular film was pornography, and this is what he decided. I shall not today attempt to further define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, but I know it when I see it, and involved in this case is not that. You can insert whatever word you like there. I put this quotation up attributed to Richard Dawkins because he begins all of his discussions on religion and evolution with this quotation, and he intends it as a humorous way of very gently breaking the ice. And those of you that know Richard Dawkins know that this is as gentle as he gets. I really put it up there because I think his latest book, from which I take this, The God Delusion, contains some very interesting ideas, but I also want to forewarn you, that it's an extreme opinion. And so while his scientific points bear merit and are correct and interesting, it might offend many among you. So I invite you to explore the text, but recognize that it's a very, very extreme opinion. However, if you look at the science that's contained therein, there's some very useful information. That's more of a warning than anything else. I thought I'd put this one up. In 1997, I was a little bit embarrassed because as a postdoc looking for a job, the Pope had outnumbered me in terms of publications. It's a little bit worrying. Nevertheless, he published this in the Quarterly Review of Biology, and I just quote, "Evolution is a serious hypothesis worthy of investigation and in-depth study equal to that of the opposing hypothesis." I cite Einstein again here because I think this is a lovely piece of prose. "The most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of all true art and science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead, a snuffed-out candle. To sense that behind anything that can be experienced, there is something that our minds cannot grasp, whose beauty and sublimity reaches us only indirectly. This is religiousness. In this sense, and in this sense only, I am a devoutly religious man." Somebody who could wear both glasses. And I decided to end with a quotation from Charles Darwin, the last sentence in The Origin of Species, 2nd edition. "There's a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved." And I think this reiterates a lot of the points that Dobzhansky made in his quotation with which we opened the discussion this evening. Okay, with that, I will pass on to Ragnar again.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much. Okay, I'm going to conclude here with a few comments, and let's see here now. I appreciate what John was saying about the wings, that 2 wings becoming 4 and legs on an antenna. And I guess all of us are going to have to interpret the significance of that. I interpret it this way. Suppose you take a book, okay? It's got chapters. Chapter 1, and there's a lot of words. Chapter 2, a lot of words. Chapter 3, a lot of words. Now, the thing I'm looking for go back to my first point, is a process whereby which new chapters are being written in this book, right? Because before there was no wing, now there's some process where later on there's a wing. So that's like in the metaphor, new wings. So to see 2 wings become 4, in my mind, is like chapter 3 doubling up, so you have 2 chapters of 3. And the question that I ask is, have we really gained anything new? And so we may have different answers on that. So if we've copied something and just copied and pasted it again in a book, I would say we really haven't gotten anything new. And in the same way, since we already got the wings, and instead of just, all it is a switch, right? There's a Hawk's gene switch. We have all the information to make a wing, and then we've rearranged the Hawk's gene switch so it says make it again over here. So now instead of making it here and here, it's also going here and here. So though we see a big change, the question is, and from my point of view, I still say I don't see anything new there, because we just doubled up on what was already existing. In the same way, if you see now antenna where the legs should be, and legs coming out your head, and those kind of things, to me that's like taking the book and scrambling your chapters, okay? And really, the question then is, if you scramble your chapters, instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if you go 10, 8, and 3, and then 1, again, the question is, have you gained any information? And I would just say no. You just, instead of rearranging the words, which is a microevolution, now you've rearranged chapters, and you're in a sense, better off. But that's the value of doing this kind of exercise, I think, because there you can kind of see, and facts never, ever speak for themselves. Facts are always interpreted. And so, but we don't realize, as John was talking about, we have glasses, and we also have mental glasses. That's the way we view the world. And so it's those glasses, those world views that we have that shape how we make that interpretation. And it's good for us to be aware that a lot of the time it's our glasses, our mental worldview, rather than the fact. John and I disagreed very little about the facts. Okay, some, but largely it's an interpretation on those facts. And so similarly, in this exercise that we do here, it's good for all of us to say, this is the fact, but here's how I'm looking at the fact. So these are the facts, and I'd agree with John, yeah, you do see 2 wings become 4 and so on. I would just say, I don't see that information again that I'm looking for. Now, if you go to embryology, if you're going to build a house, and then you're going to build a skyscraper, when you start out, you have a hole in the ground. And it looks very similar. You can say, there's a hole in the ground here, and there's a hole in the ground here. One may be a little bit bigger. But the difference between the house and the building was there from the beginning. It was there in the blueprints. And so they're only similar at a superficial level, the hole in the ground for the house and the hole in the ground, because you're starting from a common base and you're working your way up. So in the same way, life starts out like a circle. Like it's, right here. And so it's similar at a superficial level, but the information to make the salamander and then the chicken's all different in the DNA. It's not similar like they're going back to something, but they're similar because all life starts out like this, and then the unfolding of the development is just unfolding what's already written in the story. So it was already there to begin with. And then when you go back to our not gill slits, but the pharyngeal pouches and the yolk sac, see, they all have a function. And yes, they are not gill slits, they're pouches, but they become our glands in our body, right? The thymus gland and so on. The yolk sac is actually, in my mind, an ingenious design, because as an adult, we make our blood inside our bones, right? Our marrow. But he doesn't have any bones yet. Okay, so how are we going to make blood for the embryo? Well, the body builds a factory that's outside, so it can There's where the blood is made while he's in embryonic stage, while the bones haven't formed yet, and the embryo still needs the blood. And then when the baby is born, ready or developed that enough so that the bones in the baby can make the blood, then the yolk sac is discarded, and because then the bones can take over. To me, as an engineer, I think that's a marvelous engineering design. It's like having, you know, something as you're building your thing. So the point here is that these things superficially look a certain way, but they're already doing a function that's not functioning like gills. There's no gills here, right? They're going to become, it's the start of becoming the glands. So we think about the bacteria flagellum. Here, actually, I see a complexity here. This is the earliest organism, but there really, what we have is an low electric motor. Chemical reactions occur here, which causes plus and minus charges, you know, protons and electrons. That causes, the plus and minus charges cause a torque, okay, twisting motion. That torque works its way up through a shaft, which cuts through the double membrane. And there's a hook here, and this little filament spins at a couple thousand RPM, and the little bacteria moves. So I look at that and think, there's an example of design. And we all have different viewpoints. One of the things, this is my last comment, and I think this exercise is a really good exercise, and I'm glad that John and I did it, because really what we want to do here is we don't want to just have one viewpoint. We want, as people, to learn the different viewpoints, okay? And so, so we want to be able to think, what are the alternatives? And so in a sense, we don't want to be like this, okay? We want to be able to express, learn different ways of looking at the data, see the different points of view, whatever the conclusions are. And maybe sometimes it's the implications of our conclusions that hold us back. So those are my closing remarks. And thank you, guys. Thank you, John. And I'm going to hand it over to Chris or John. Okay.
So I just want to briefly provide my absolute concluding remarks. I want to start by thanking you all for coming out and thanking Chris and Ragnar for the event. In case I did offend anybody, I apologize. It was not intentional, despite my being an evolutionary biologist. I do want to respond to 3 points, I guess. First one is that the developmental data that you presented, if you look across the metazoa, that is the true animals, and you look at how development occurs, we can separate groups into 2 major groups. The ones that you showed all being vertebrates all are deuterostomes, and so it's true that they all start off as a single egg and then they start to cleave, but the cleavage is very different from what you might see in a Drosophila or any other of the invertebrates, or most of the invertebrates. I should include one of my favorite groups, the echinoderms. But protostomes differ in their planes of cleavage, and the initial development differs from that point onward, so very, very early in development. So there are reasons to suspect that the information, if you like to call it that, that's encoded in the genomes do provide evidence of ancestry. The other part I neglected to mention, and maybe this is vital to part of the argument, that the transition that I showed, for instance, from the antenna to the legs, has real implications. If we look at crustaceans, arthropods, closely related to insects, but outside of the insects, we see that they have mouth parts known as maxillipids. These are feeding structures, but they resemble legs. And for a long time, they kind of puzzled evolutionary biologists because you had these sort of legs near the mouth. Well, that kind of transformation or transition, it's a little less than a wholesale change, now can be explained by these switches that you refer to. Thank you for using that term too. So these genetic switches that can change things macroscopically in the course of, say, even a generation. And so now those mysterious feeding appendages can be explained as a result of a single mutation. The other point I want to raise again is that intelligent design was purported as science. That's how it was introduced into the human culture, if you like. And so my warnings to everyone in this room were genuine in the sense that I think you all should explore. If you're a scientist and you've never explored it before, it's worth reading about at least once to make up your mind. And if you find something in there inside yourself, then you can keep reading about it. But if you don't, then you can put it down forever. And similarly, for the people that are proponents of intelligent design, I suggest that you pick up The Origin of Species and give it a good read, and I'm sure many of you have, and weigh the evidence for yourselves. Ultimately, that's the only choice you have to make. And you have to decide which glasses you want to wear when and how you want to interpret your worldview. So with that, I'll pass back to Ragnar, and thank you all for a pleasant evening.